In the shadows of Britain's cities, beneath the surface of everyday life, there exists a world governed by different rules, not the laws written in courtrooms, but codes forged in back alleys and prison cells, codes of loyalty, of respect, of debts that must be paid. And when those codes are broken, the consequences are brutal and irreversible. This is not a story about random violence. This is about cycles, patterns of revenge that repeat across years, across cities, feeding on themselves until they consume everyone they touch. From the underground empire of a sadistic crime lord in the 1990s, to gang wars that turned town centers into hunting grounds, to betrayals within drug networks that ended in cold-blooded executions, these cases reveal how violence in Britain's criminal underworld doesn't just happen. It escalates, it metastates, it becomes inevitable. Before we go deeper into these interconnected stories of loyalty, betrayal, and revenge, subscribe if you're interested in true crime documentaries that examine not just what happened, but why it keeps happening. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. What you're about to hear spans 3 decades and 4 separate investigations, but they're all connected by a single thread. When someone breaks the code, someone else decides they must pay. And that payment is always extracted in blood. To understand how cycles of violence take root, we must first go back to where these patterns were established. Back to a time when one man demonstrated that through sufficient cruelty, you could build an empire on fear alone. The city of Glasgow in the 1980s was no stranger to violence. Gang culture had existed there for generations. Territorial disputes were common, and the drug trade was rapidly expanding. But even in that environment, Martin Hamilton stood out. Not because he was physically imposing. He was short, overweight, and unremarkable to look at. He stood out because of what he was willing to do. Hamilton grew up in Maryhill, northwest Glasgow, just streets from the Cranston Hill police station. The proximity to law enforcement meant nothing to him, even as a child. Other students learned quickly to avoid him on the school bus. Teachers noted his unpredictability. By the time he was 17, he was already carrying weapons, and in 1984, he received his first adult sentence for assault with intent to cause serious injury. What made Hamilton different from other young criminals wasn't ambition or business acumen. It was his methodology. While other dealers competed for territory or customers, Hamilton targeted the vulnerable, young men trapped in addiction or debt, and he didn't just threaten them. He destroyed them psychologically. Reports that emerged years later described a pattern of sexual violence, humiliation, and torture designed not just to collect debts, but to ensure complete submission and silence. He operated alone, refusing to pledge loyalty to any of Glasgow's established crime families. This independence made him unpredictable, difficult to control, and increasingly dangerous. By the early 1990s, he'd survived 2 shootings outside his own home. The press began calling him Scotland's most hated man, a title he never disputed. In 1992, Hamilton and 3 associates attempted an armed robbery of a building society equipped with knives and an imitation firearm. Police had been tipped off, and the operation collapsed within minutes. Hamilton received another prison sentence, but investigators knew they'd only scratched the surface. The real crimes, the torture, the sexual assaults, the systematic terrorizing of entire communities, remained hidden because his victims were too frightened to speak. Upon his release, Hamilton recognized that Glasgow had become too dangerous for him. He'd fallen out with Arthur Thompson, one of the city's most powerful crime figures, over a botched contract killing. With bridges burned and enemies accumulating, he moved east to Edinburgh in the late 1990s. Edinburgh's west side presented different opportunities. The criminal networks there were more fractured, with fewer major players controlling territory. For someone like Hamilton, violent, autonomous, and experienced in filling power vacuums, it was ideal terrain. He settled into areas like Broomhouse, Wester Hailes, and Sighthill, working-class neighborhoods where unemployment and drug addiction provided a ready pool of vulnerable people to exploit. Edinburgh police weren't familiar with him initially. Their counterparts in Glasgow knew Hamilton well, but the warning hadn't been transmitted in time. What followed was a wave of violence that Edinburgh hadn't experienced in years. Hamilton didn't just deal drugs, he took over territory by force. He would give teenage dealers heroin and ecstasy, then demand daily payments. When they couldn't pay, he made examples of them. Court documents that emerged later described horrific punishments. One boy had his finger amputated, another nearly lost an eye to a teaspoon, others were beaten, scolded, and sexually assaulted. Local pub landlords became targets next. One later admitted paying £30,000 just to keep Hamilton away from his establishment. Another who tried to do business with him ended up shot in the head and left in a ditch. Police finally responded by launching a 24-hour surveillance operation. They tracked his movements, logged his meetings, documented his network. But they still couldn't act because witnesses wouldn't speak. Victims were vanishing. Hamilton's hold on the community was growing stronger, not weaker. In just months, he'd transformed scattered supply lines into a personal empire built entirely on fear. But fear, as Hamilton would eventually discover, is a fragile foundation, and he was about to push too far. The case that finally broke through involved a teenage couple, both 18, who came to a Glasgow flat to collect drugs. What followed was a 10-hour ordeal of systematic torture. They were beaten until they couldn't stand, then tied up and forced to strip. Their cheeks were pierced with a blade. Boiling water was poured over their skin. To avoid blood on the carpets, Hamilton made them stand in a bathtub while he shouted instructions and others carried them out. But this time his victims survived, and critically they talked. The court recognized the extreme risk. The trial was moved 200 miles away to Inverness, with no media coverage and no open records. The couple was placed under one of the highest witness protection regimes ever implemented in Scotland. Their testimony changed everything. Other victims, addicts, dealers, landlords, began coming forward slowly and carefully. The stories were consistent, scars in the same places, threats repeated word for word. One man described being tortured with pliers. Another spoke of being set on fire. A third described being sodomized at knife point, then told his family would disappear if he talked. This wasn't enforcement, this was sadism practiced over years. But for the first time, prosecutors had enough evidence to build charges that would stick. In November 2000, after a 6-week trial at the High Court in Inverness, Martin Hamilton was found guilty of 11 charges, including drug dealing, abduction, assault, and torture. The jury couldn't agree on additional charges, including multiple sexual offences, but what stuck was enough. Lord Kingarth handed down a life sentence with a minimum of 9 years, describing Hamilton as a man who took sadistic pleasure in the infliction of pain and the inspiration of real terror. The verdict closed one chapter, but few believed it would end there. Hamilton wasn't someone who faded quietly into the prison system, and they were right to be concerned. At HMP shots, Hamilton maintained his distance from the general population, not out of fear but because other inmates feared him. Guards reportedly used his name as a threat. Step out of line and you'd end up in a cell next to Hamilton. But more disturbing were reports of what he did inside. Hamilton volunteered as a listener, a scheme where older inmates offered support to vulnerable prisoners at risk of self-harm or suicide. It was supposed to be a safeguard. Instead, it gave him access. Multiple accounts later described how he used those sessions to isolate young offenders. One man who'd been on suicide watch reported that Hamilton raped him twice, once inside prison, once during a coerced meeting on day release. Too traumatized to report it at the time, he only came forward years later when he learned Hamilton might face fresh charges. Others remained silent. Even behind bars, the abuse continued. Hamilton had proven that with sufficient cruelty, you could maintain control anywhere, even in a maximum security prison. In September 2014, having served the minimum term of his life sentence, Martin Hamilton was released on license. To the system, it was a controlled release. To those who knew him, it was a warning sign. Within months, Hamilton began slipping back into the life he was meant to leave behind. He returned to familiar routines, reconnecting with underworld contacts, moving through towns west of Edinburgh. Police believe he was re-establishing himself as a collector, a role that gave him leverage without drawing direct attention. One job in particular stood out. A dealer had been injured in a motorbike crash and hospitalized. Hamilton was asked to step in and manage the dealer's customer debts, essentially taking over the tick book for cocaine transactions. It should have been straightforward. Collect what was owed, roughly £40,000, and pass it to the Liverpool crew behind the supply line. But the money disappeared. Sources said Hamilton kept it. Some claimed he never intended to hand it over. Others believed he was stalling, trying to use the cash to restart his own operations. Either way, the result was the same. He'd crossed people with reach, money, and a reputation for making examples. By April 2015, Hamilton had vanished. He was due to appear at Glasgow Sheriff Court for breaching his license conditions. He didn't show. A warrant was issued. Police launched a national appeal, calling him potentially dangerous and warning the public not to approach. Crime Stoppers offered a £2,000 reward. BBC's Crime Watch aired his face, but Martin Hamilton was already gone. No bank activity, no phone records, not a single confirmed sighting after April 16th when he was last seen around Great Western Road in Glasgow. On December 17, 2015, a dog walker veered off a woodland path near West Calder, just past the B7015 road, close to the edge of the Five Sisters Business Park. They saw a skull, a portion of spine, nothing else. It was clear this wasn't a recent death. Whoever had buried him had made sure of that. Over the following days, specialists worked the site. Pathologists confirmed the remains were human. DNA tests followed. Quietly, without a press conference or announcement, a name emerged: Martin Hamilton. He'd been missing for 8 months. Now he was back, buried in a shallow grave in the cold soil of West Lothian. Detectives didn't call it murder at first. Officially, it was unexplained. But off the record, they knew. The injuries were clear: blunt force trauma, sharp force damage to the skull, and a bullet to the head. According to intelligence sources, this wasn't random. This was an execution. The main suspect emerged early. James Farrell, 53, a Liverpool native with known ties to West Lothian and a history of drug-related violence. He'd been living just miles from where Hamilton's remains were discovered. Investigators had received intelligence from underworld sources, whispers that Hamilton had ripped off a Liverpool-based crew for £40,000 and that Farrell had been the one told to deal with it. Forensic searches of nearby properties, phone data, and movement records began to narrow the circle. When Farrell's name surfaced again in connection to the same drug circles Hamilton had tried to re-enter, police moved in. He was charged with Hamilton's murder, accused of shooting him, then inflicting sharp and blunt force trauma to destroy evidence. He was also charged with attempting to defeat the ends of justice by burying the body, and with Class A drug offenses tied to cocaine and heroin supply. But he never stood trial. Diagnosed with terminal cancer shortly after his arrest, Farrell was released from custody in early 2017. He died weeks later, taking with him the last direct line of accountability. Martin Hamilton's funeral was delayed for over 8 months while investigators worked the case. When it finally took place, only a handful attended. The man once feared in 2 cities left quietly, with no public eulogy, no headlines, no convictions followed, no final justice arrived. Hamilton, the Black Hill butcher, had spent a lifetime building power through fear. In the end, it made him untouchable, until someone decided to prove he wasn't. Hamilton's story demonstrates how violence can build empires, but what happens when that violence becomes currency in a different kind of economy, one where debts aren't measured in pounds but in blood, and where every act of aggression demands an equal or greater response? The answer to that question began unfolding on a cold January night in 2023, in a town centre that should have been safe. Walsall town centre on January 28, 2023, at 1:20 in the morning, was almost empty. Market stalls stood silent in the cold night air. A car rolled past, its headlights cutting through the dark, while another followed close behind. Inside, 7 young men sat in silence, each knowing what was about to unfold. Bailey Atkinson, just 21, was walking through Walsall's market area with a female friend. Those who knew him described him as kind-hearted, someone who would do anything for people close to him. But his past lingered. Bailey had moved to Walsall from Coventry 2 years earlier, hoping to escape a gang lifestyle that had already claimed too many lives around him. Police would later confirm there were tensions, old disputes that hadn't been forgotten. In Walsall, Bailey tried to carve out a different life. He spent time with friends, stayed close to his family, kept to familiar places. On the night of January 28th, he was simply out with a friend. Nothing unusual, just another quiet weekend evening. What he didn't know was that others had decided his fate long before that night began. The 7 young men hunting him were barely out of their teenage years. Some were still under 18, but together they formed a unit that moved with practiced, calculated violence. Patrick Brooks, 18, of Hunter Crescent, was described as one of the core instigators. Ronan McCulloch, 19, from Livingston Road, and Sononi Loveridge, 20, of Irvine Road, were equally involved, older members who helped coordinate the attack. Benjamin Wilkes, 18, of Guild Avenue, had joined them, as had 3 younger boys, all 17, who cannot be named for legal reasons. The plan had begun days earlier with the theft of 2 cars, a black Seat Leon and a Toyota Verso. They weren't random vehicles. They were chosen for speed and anonymity, stripped of any identifiable links. Witnesses and CCTV would later show the killers meeting up in a supermarket car park, preparing for what was to come. According to police, this was not spontaneous street violence. The killers were fueled by revenge, linked to an ongoing feud that had already cast a shadow over Walsall. They drove out that night not just to confront Bailey, but to trap him. CCTV later revealed how methodically they moved, turning, slowing, maneuvering with precision to ensure Bailey had nowhere left to run. As he walked with his friend near the market stalls, the cars closed in. One swerved directly toward them, forcing Bailey to bolt while his friend ran in the opposite direction. In those desperate seconds, he was just a young man trying to outrun death, sprinting down the high street past shuttered shops. But the chase was relentless. The Seat Leon cornered him outside Poundland. One of the attackers stepped out. Bailey ran again, back toward the market stalls, clinging to a lamppost for balance as the car charged at him once more. Within moments, he was on the ground. The 7 young men swarmed, surrounding him. The final moments were captured on chilling CCTV. Bailey stumbled, collapsing as the attackers struck again and again. When the violence stopped, he was left lying on the pavement, blood pooling beneath him. The gang didn't look back. They fled to the waiting cars, vanishing into the night as quickly as they'd arrived. Witnesses from a nearby Asda, stepping outside for a break, saw part of the scene. They later told police how the assailants rained blows on Bailey. One of the weapons was a 24-centimeter Rambo knife. The damage was catastrophic. Bailey's body had more than 30 stab wounds, deep cuts to his back, arms and legs, some puncturing vital organs. He was rushed to Queen Elizabeth Hospital in Birmingham, but at 2:55 a.m. he was pronounced dead. His last words, according to police, were simple and devastating. "I'm going to die. Tell my mum I love her." A post-mortem would later reveal 65 separate injuries, wounds that told the story of a coordinated assault designed not just to kill, but to obliterate. In the days after the attack, Walsall High Street transformed into a site of mourning. Flowers piled high against shop fronts, cards, candles, and photos of Bailey covered the pavement. Friends and strangers stood in silence, trying to make sense of the brutality. Bailey's family released a statement through West Midlands Police. "Our kind-hearted and much-loved son, brother, and grandson. Bailey was so loved by so many and will be missed so much." For them, Bailey was not a victim of gang violence or street feuds. He was a young man who had been trying to build a different life, only to have it stolen from him. The killing triggered one of the most complex manhunts West Midlands Police had conducted in recent years. Within minutes of the murder, the cars used in the attack were found burned out on grassland near Slater Street and Guff Street, their flames lighting up the night sky. From that point, the focus shifted to identifying those inside the cars. CCTV was gathered from across Walsall town centre, showing how it happened piece by piece. Detectives retraced the stolen cars' routes from their ignition point to the scene of the attack. Camera footage became one of the most vital breakthroughs. Cameras around the town centre captured not only the pursuit, but the critical moments when suspects climbed out of the cars, preparing to strike. In some frames, their faces were clearly visible, caught in the glare of nearby security cameras, evidence impossible to deny. Mobile phone analysis backed up these visuals. Investigators mapped out the suspects' phones, confirming they had met earlier that night in a supermarket car park before heading into Walsall. It was a coordinated hunt, and every piece of digital data helped tie the group together. In the weeks that followed, early morning raids across Walsall, Bloxwich and Pen Green led to a string of arrests. Patrick Brooks, Ronan McCulloch, Sonani Loveridge and Benjamin Wilkes were all taken into custody. 3 17-year-old boys were also arrested. Detective Inspector Jim Munro described the case as one of the most complex his team had faced. It relied on a blend of CCTV, phone data, forensic evidence and witness statements, including accounts from staff at a nearby Asda who had rushed to Bailey's aid. Police later confirmed the group's motive was revenge for an earlier assault involving a relative of one of the attackers, a feud that had been brewing for months. On May 24, 2024, Nottingham Crown Court delivered its verdict. 7 young men stood in the dock, each convicted of Bailey Atkinson's murder. During the trial, prosecutors presented damning evidence, mobile phone data, CCTV tracking, and forensic proof that this was no random act of violence, but a deliberate hunt. The prosecution highlighted how the gang operated like a pack, passing weapons between them, ensuring Bailey had no chance to escape. The defendants denied involvement, but the jury found them guilty after reviewing overwhelming evidence. Judge Michael Chambers KC condemned the brutality, describing it as a ruthless and cowardly act of violence where the victim was hunted down and given no opportunity to defend himself. Patrick Brooks received life imprisonment with a minimum term of 20 years. Ronan McCulloch received life with a minimum of 20 years. Sonani Loveridge was given life with a minimum of 23 years, the longest of the group due to his leading role in coordinating the attack. Benjamin Wilkes was sentenced to life with a minimum of 18 years. The 3 17-year-old boys were each detained for life with minimum terms of 19 years. But the conviction of Bailey Atkinson's killers did not bring closure. It fanned the flames of anger. Among Bailey's friends, talk of retaliation was already in motion, a determination to avenge his death and strike back at those connected to the Brooks family. The cycle that claimed Bailey Atkinson's life didn't end with 7 convictions. It simply moved to the next phase. Because in the world these young men inhabited, every act of violence demands a response, and that response must be visible, public, and severe enough to restore lost respect. Reports later confirmed that revenge was carefully plotted. Bailey's friends weren't acting on impulse. They were planning a statement of violence. They scouted vehicles, settling on a stolen black Ford Focus. It wasn't chosen at random. The car would become the weapons delivery system, fitted with false plates and stripped of anything that could lead back to them. Behind this plan were 3 key figures: Jake Sambrook, Byron Seelich, and Julian Falconer, all young men with close ties to Bailey. Each of them knew the weight of what they were about to do. Alongside them was Samuel Danks Petty, whose job would be to ensure nothing was left behind. No car, no trace, no evidence that could tie them to the revenge attack. On the afternoon of July 8, 2023, violence returned to Walsall. It was just before 5 p.m. when Connor Brooks and his friend Bradley Sladeson parked up in a van on Well Lane, Blake Heath. Families were nearby. Children were leaving school. The street was alive with the usual summer bustle, until the black Ford Focus appeared. This was the same stolen Focus that Bailey Atkinson's friends had prepared for weeks. It rolled slowly past the van. Just 6 seconds later, a passenger window slid down. A shotgun was raised. A single blast shattered the quiet. The shot tore through the driver's side, striking Connor in the head. Bradley, in the passenger seat, felt the impact on his left shoulder as he ducked. He would survive. Connor slumped against the window, his life ending before help could arrive. Witnesses described scenes of chaos as parents pulled children away from the area, unsure if more shots would follow. The attackers didn't stop. The Focus accelerated and fled the scene within seconds. Just minutes later, it was driven to Worley Lane, where the murder weapon, a double-barreled sawn-off shotgun, was dumped in a bin bag. This was not a random attack. Investigators quickly tied the shooting to the murder of Bailey Atkinson. Samuel Danks Petty had changed number plates and ensured their escape. Connor Brooks, just 20 years old, was pronounced dead at the scene. Detectives knew from the start that the killers had left a trail, and they intended to follow it piece by piece. The stolen black Ford Focus was the first breakthrough. Within minutes of the shooting, It was seen fleeing Well Lane at speed. Less than an hour later, it was found abandoned on Worley Lane. Inside, forensic teams recovered gunshot residue, fingerprints, and crucial DNA evidence. Investigators also discovered that the sawn-off shotgun used in the attack had been dumped nearby in a bin bag, still carrying traces of the brutal strike. CCTV cameras across Walsall told the rest of the story. Detectives pulled hundreds of hours of footage, tracking the focus from its movements earlier in the day to the seconds leading up to the murder. The car was seen cruising near the van multiple times, confirming that the attack was no random drive-by, but a planned ambush. Mobile phone data was key, linking Sambrook, Selleck, Falconer and Danks-Petty together in the lead-up and aftermath of the shooting. By mid-April 2024, detectives had built a watertight case. The combined evidence of CCTV, DNA and digital forensics left no room for doubt. The four men were arrested and charged with murder, attempted murder, and possession of a firearm with intent to endanger life. On May 30, 2024, Wolverhampton Crown Court delivered its judgment on the brutal killing of Connor Brooks. Jake Sambrook, 23, of Fisher Road, Bloxwich, was identified as the driver of the stolen Ford Focus. He received a life sentence with a minimum term of 29 years. Byron Seelick, 20, of No Fixed Abode, was also sentenced to life with a minimum term of 29 years. Julian Falconer, 20, of Whitley Close, Willenhall, who was a backseat passenger believed to have encouraged the shooting, was handed the same sentence, life with a minimum of 29 years. Samuel Danks-Petty, 21, of Buildwas Close, Walsall, who helped the killers cover their tracks by hiding the car and switching number plates, was convicted of perverting the course of justice. He was jailed for 3 years, 2 killings, 14 convictions. And in the end, what had been gained? Bailey Atkinson was still dead. Connor Brooks was still dead. Families on both sides were shattered. Young men who might have had futures were now serving life sentences. This is what revenge looks like when it becomes a currency. Not justice, not resolution. Just an endless exchange of violence that consumes everyone it touches. But the pattern doesn't end there. Because while gang feuds grab headlines and shock communities, some of the most calculated killings happen not in the heat of rivalry, but in the cold arithmetic of business. If gang feuds represent violence as emotional response, then what happened to Sam Davies represents something different, violence as enforcement, as business practice, as the price of breaking trust within an organized criminal hierarchy. By the spring of 2021, Sam Davies wasn't the same person he'd been when he joined the network. What had started as just another route to fast money had turned into something else, harder to manage, harder to walk away from. He was 23 with a background that didn't fit the typical narrative. He'd studied. He had plans to return to university, but somewhere along the way, the weight of the lifestyle caught up with him. Those closest to him saw the shift. His girlfriend described sudden mood swings, rising paranoia, and a growing sense of fear that wouldn't leave him. Instead of stepping back, he turned to self-medication, not through prescriptions but through contacts. He started buying Xanax from a rival dealer, someone known in local circles who had reason to pull him in. The pills gave him temporary calm, but they also made him vulnerable, easy to sway and control. That rival dealer, according to witness statements, was someone Sam began to trust more than his own crew. To understand what happened to Sam, you need to understand the structure he was part of. Daniel Haydari wasn't the type most expected to run a criminal network. He'd graduated from the University of Lincoln and kept a quiet profile. But by 2021, he'd built a drug supply business that moved serious weight. He was one of the biggest cannabis wholesalers in Lincoln, earning over £500,000 a year. He stayed at the top of the street-level chain and oversaw supply. He didn't handle sales himself. That was left to people like Joe Jameson, younger, local and well-connected. Jameson operated further down the line, but with volume. He bought on tick from Haydari, resold it to local dealers, and repaid on time. It was clean, structured, and lucrative. Jameson's crew moved fast, and one of his trusted runners was Sam Davies. At 23, Sam had drifted from university life into dealing. He wasn't violent or loud. People described him as calm, charismatic, someone who kept things moving without making noise. He wasn't in charge, but he had access. He knew the routes, the drop-offs, everyone in the chain. For a while, it ran without problems. Haidari handled supply. Jameson kept the line moving. Sam delivered on the ground. But when money started falling behind and one of Jameson's stashes disappeared, that structure cracked and attention turned sharply to those within. The first sign of trouble was that one of Joe Jameson's safe houses had been hit, and it was clean. An estimated £8,000 worth of cannabis was taken. But it wasn't just the product that raised alarms. A laptop belonging to someone inside the network was gone too, and whatever was on it made the loss more serious than street value. Jameson was already in debt. He owed Daniel Haidari tens of thousands from previous tick deals. The stolen stash only deepened the pressure. Questions started moving fast. No forced entry, no sign of random theft. Whoever did it knew exactly where to look. Two names came up. One was a rival dealer known locally with history. The other was Sam Davies. It didn't make sense at first. Sam had been part of the crew, trusted and consistent, but something had shifted. A few weeks after, there were rumors of a second theft, smaller but still connected to Sam. His behavior grew more erratic. He told friends he believed someone was watching him. He started warning people that there was a contract out on his life worth £20,000. In the weeks before the stash house was robbed, Sam and the rival dealer were seen together more often. The theory circulated that Davies had likely shared the location of Jameson's stash with the rival dealer he was now using for pills. The theory was simple. Sam hadn't broken in himself, but he'd made it possible. And once that message spread through the network, it didn't take long for the decision to be made. Sam left without explanation and went to Nottingham. He returned a week later. In the days before the attack, Jameson tracked down Sam's girlfriend. Calmly, he told her that if she was hiding Sam, he'd kill him. If she was lying, she'd be next. To keep their hold on the lines, Daniel Haidari and Joe Jameson needed to send a message, not just to Davies, but to anyone else watching. That message came in the form of a contract. According to evidence heard in court, Haidari reached out to Billy Gill, a younger associate within the local scene. In a message, Haidari kept it short, asking if Gill knew anyone who could dip someone. Gill didn't hesitate and passed on a name, Imantas Gaupman, a 20-year-old with a record and someone Gill said had done that stuff before. From that point, the plan moved quickly. Phone records later presented to the jury showed an intense flurry of contact between Haidari, Jameson, Gill, and Gaupman in the lead-up to the attack. Messages went back and forth throughout the afternoon and evening of May 27th. CCTV later confirmed that Gaupman had changed into all-black clothing that night before leaving his house. He was captured moving through the area, heading towards Seedage Gardens where the attack would happen. On the evening of May 27, 2021, Sam Davies believed he was heading to meet someone he trusted, possibly a dealer, someone he'd met through Lincoln's drug scene. He didn't know it was a setup. At 10:30 p.m., a taxi picked him up and dropped him off near Browning Drive, close to Seedage Gardens, a quiet residential area in Lincoln's St. Giles estate. Evidence later revealed he believed he was collecting Xanax, something he'd been using regularly in the weeks before, but the person he thought he was meeting never existed. The messages, the invite, and the location were all orchestrated. Waiting in the shadows was Imantas Gaupman. Gaupman had come prepared. He wore dark clothes and was armed with a replica Rambo-style knife. At about 10:45 p.m., as Sam made his way through the quiet estate, Gaupman approached him without warning. 2 deep knife wounds, both to the chest. The attack was fast and brutal. Sam didn't collapse immediately. Somehow he stayed on his feet. Bleeding heavily, he staggered down the street and made it to a nearby house. He knocked. A resident opened the door to find him slumped and soaked in blood, struggling to speak. Emergency services were called within minutes. Paramedics attempted life-saving treatment at the scene, later taking him to Queen's Medical Centre in Nottingham, where doctors performed open-heart surgery. But the damage was too severe. At 2:45 a.m., Sam Davies was pronounced dead. The crime had been silent, but the crew had left behind noise, data, footage, and digital footprints that would build the case brick by brick. It began with the knife. After the attack, police secured the scene at Seedage Gardens. In the search that followed, officers recovered the weapon, discarded near the site. Forensic analysis confirmed Imantas Gaupman's DNA on it. Next came the phone records. Detectives mapped out communications between Haidari, Jameson, Gill and Gaupman on the day of the murder. The volume and timing were crucial. Messages had flowed between them throughout May 27th, growing more frequent as evening approached. The contact spiked in the final hours leading up to the stabbing, then dropped immediately after. Investigators also retrieved chat logs and texts, including the one where Haidari was asking for the killer. Then came the CCTV footage. Cameras tracked Gaupman in the hours before the attack. He was seen leaving a pub, heading home, and changing into all black clothing. Later, more footage captured him moving through the St. Giles area, walking toward the location where Sam Davies had been lured. Finally, there was the link to the fake meetup. The person Sam thought he was meeting had used a new number, but that number, police found, was traced back to Gaupman. Each piece alone wasn't enough, but together, it was airtight. A discarded knife, a coded message, a fake invite. The Crown called it premeditated, coordinated, and impossible to explain away. On January 12, 2022, the trial began at Nottingham Crown Court. The case was heard before the Honourable Mr. Justice Goss and would run for more than 13 weeks. The prosecution presented a case built on coordination and premeditation. They laid out the evidence gathered by police during the investigation. Text messages, phone records, and CCTV footage were central to the Crown's case, especially the message sent by Daniel Haidari to arrange the hit. The defense attempted to challenge the meaning of the messages. They argued that the word dip was slang for robbery, not violence, and that there was no proof the intention was to kill. They also questioned Sam Davies's character, pointing to his own mental health struggles, his fallout with Jameson, and his alleged involvement in drug activity and theft. But the jury didn't accept that version. On April 6, 2022, the jury delivered a unanimous verdict. 4 men were found guilty of murder. 6 days later, sentencing was handed down. Joe Jameson, aged 24, was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 25 years. The court found that he had played a leading role in orchestrating the attack and threatening Sam's girlfriend. Daniel Haidari, 25, also received life with a minimum of 25 years. He was identified as the senior figure in the operation, the one who funded and authorized the hit. Imantas Gaupman, 20, the man who carried out the stabbing, was sentenced to life in prison, serving a minimum of 24 years. Billy Gill, 21, was handed life with a minimum of 23 years. 4 men went down for murder. But for the Davies family, no sentence could undo what was lost. What these 3 cases, Hamilton, Atkinson, Brooks, Davies, demonstrate is a brutal economic truth. In criminal networks, violence isn't irrational, it's functional. It enforces debts, maintains hierarchy, and signals to others what happens when rules are broken. But there's one more case that shows how this logic extends even into institutions designed to prevent it. How even prison walls can't contain cycles of revenge when someone decides betrayal must be punished. Lenny Scott wasn't the kind of man who made enemies easily. At 33, he was known for being a devoted father, a solid friend, and someone who took pride in his work. He lived in Prescott, balancing his job as a former prison officer with raising his 3 young children. To those around him, Lenny was the kind of man who would do anything for his family, a gentle giant, as those closest to him described him. He had a love of football, once playing for local teams like the Rainhill Rockets, and was remembered for his easy sense of humor and a natural warmth that drew people to him. Working at HMP Alt Course meant dealing with hardened criminals, and over time he had earned a reputation among colleagues for being sharp and observant. It was this keen eye that would place him in the path of dangerous events, one that started with a forbidden relationship and ended with his name at the center of a murder trial. Before the murder, there was a betrayal, one that began inside the walls of HMP Alt Course. Elias Morgan, 35, was serving time when he became involved in an illicit relationship with a female prison officer, Sarah Williams. It was a secret that could have cost her career and his freedom. Hidden messages, a contraband phone, all of it was kept behind the bars of the Liverpool prison. But one man found out. Lenny Scott, Then a prison officer himself discovered Morgan's phone. Inside were messages that exposed the affair. It wasn't just evidence of rule-breaking, it was leverage, something Morgan could not allow to get out. According to the prosecution, Lenny was offered £1,500 to stay quiet, money he refused to take. That refusal marked him. Witnesses later told the court how Morgan reacted with cold anger. He told Lenny that he would bide his time and promised to get him, making a gun gesture as if sealing the threat. For Morgan, this wasn't just about the risk of exposure. It was about pride, control, and the humiliation of being outed by a guard. The tension between the two men didn't fade with time. In fact, prosecutors argue it deepened into something darker. By the time Morgan left prison, the grudge had grown into a plan for retaliation. What began as a secret affair inside a prison would spiral into a violent feud, one that would spill out onto the streets of Skelmersdale. The events leading to Lenny Scott's death began long before the shots were fired on Peel Road. By mid-2023, links between Elias Morgan and Anthony Cleary were already under scrutiny. Cleary, 29, was not a known violent offender like Morgan, but prosecutors say he played a vital supporting role. In June 2023, just days after Morgan entered a not guilty plea over possession of the illicit phone found by Lenny Scott, he was photographed at Glastonbury Festival. Cleary was with him. Pictures recovered from Cleary's handset, later presented in court, showed the pair posing together. It was the start of a pattern of movement and contact that prosecutors say connected them in the months leading up to the murder. From July to December 2023, Morgan's Mercedes GLC became a crucial thread in the investigation. Telematics data revealed the car had been in Spain from at least July 11th until December 11th. Between November 12th and 19th, a mobile number attributed to Morgan was active on networks in both the UAE and Spain, evidence that mapped his movements across multiple countries. Cleary's role began to emerge during this time. Court evidence showed that on December 12th, phones linked to both men crossed from Spain into France. An Instagram message retrieved from Cleary's account revealed he told an associate he was with "my partner and a mate," and that they were bringing a car back from Spain with a few stops along the way. Images retrieved from Cleary's handset placed them together in Paris. A quiet snapshot of a journey prosecutors argue was key to the events that followed. Prosecutors also claim Cleary was responsible for securing the Vauxhall combo van and the electric motorbike later used in the attack. Acting on Morgan's instructions, he is said to have arranged their delivery to areas near Skelmersdale, ensuring the gunman would have both transport and a quick escape route. By December 13th, Morgan's Mercedes was back in Liverpool. By early January 2024, the prosecution said Morgan's plan was already moving into its final phase. On January 3rd, he allegedly carried out what prosecutors have called a recce day, a reconnaissance mission to map out Lenny Scott's routines and key locations connected to him. ANPR cameras first captured Morgan's car traveling west along Speke Boulevard at 1:47 p.m., heading toward the Mecca Gym in Speke, one of Lenny's regular spots. Between 1:49 p.m. and 1:59 p.m., CCTV tracked the same vehicle circling along Garscube Road, close to the gym, before looping back. Later that afternoon, the focus shifted closer to Lenny's home. At 5:57 p.m., Morgan's Ford Fiesta triggered an ANPR camera along Warrington Road in Prescott, placing him in the vicinity of Hawthorne Road, where Lenny lived. By 6:48 p.m., the same phone linked to Morgan connected to a cell site covering the area around Peel House in Skelmersdale, the gym where Lenny would ultimately be shot. CCTV presented in court showed two unidentified men approaching the entrance to Peel House between 6:56 p.m. and 7:08 p.m. before walking away. Just minutes later, Morgan's phone was recorded again, this time pinging a different cell on the far side of the motorway. By 8:06 p.m., his car was recorded heading back into Liverpool. During this time, prosecutors say Anthony Cleary was taking on a critical supporting role, preparing the van and electric motorbike, moving them into position near the gym to give the shooter both access and a rapid escape route. It was the final layer of planning before the fatal ambush just weeks later. February 8, 2024, began like any other day for Lenny Scott. By evening, the father of three was heading to Peel House Gym on Peel Road in Skelmersdale, unaware that someone was waiting for him. Prosecutors allege that Elias Morgan, wearing a high-visibility jacket and carrying a handgun, lay in wait near the car park. At 7:35 p.m., as Lenny left the gym and paused near his car to speak with a friend, the gunman approached. According to court evidence, Lenny's companion noticed the masked figure and recalled him saying, "Who's that guy in a mask?" Moments before, 6 shots rang out. The gunman fired at close range, hitting Lenny in the head and body. Emergency services were called immediately, but despite the efforts of medics and bystanders, including 2 ex-army medics who attempted first aid, Lenny's injuries were catastrophic. CCTV then captured the shooter fleeing on the electric motorbike, which was loaded into a van nearby. Lenny Scott was taken under armed escort to Aintree University Hospital, but he was pronounced dead at 10:50 p.m. Lancashire police launched a major murder investigation within hours. Detectives quickly cordoned off Peel Road, while forensics teams combed the car park for evidence. Spent 9mm bullet casings were recovered alongside CCTV footage that would become crucial. The footage showed a masked figure in black clothing wearing an orange high-visibility jacket. Public appeals went out almost immediately. Officers urged anyone who had seen a rider on an electric or scrambler bike to come forward. Within days, a 25-year-old man from Liverpool was arrested on suspicion of murder. He was later released on bail. 3 other men aged 27, 34 and 37 were also arrested across Merseyside. As the evidence trail deepened, investigators turned their attention to Elias Morgan's Mercedes GLC. This vehicle had been tracked for months through telematics and ANPR data. But after the murder, the car became a key forensic target. False number plates were discovered, and the search uncovered Morgan's fingerprints on both the front and rear plates. Blood with his DNA was found behind a removed control panel, linking him further to the vehicle. All of this, combined with the reconnaissance timeline cell site data and international travel records, formed the backbone of the prosecution's case, revealing a web of planning, movement and calculated escape routes that prosecutors say tied both Morgan and Anthony Cleary to the attack. In the days after the shooting, Lenny Scott's family spoke of a man whose life revolved around his children, his work, and his close-knit community. Tributes poured in for the 33-year-old father of 3 from Prescott, remembered as a gentle giant and a devoted dad who was both strong and deeply caring. His family statement reflected the devastation his death left behind. They described Lenny as the biggest, funniest, and most lovable person, and said their lives had been torn apart. For his children, the loss was even more profound. He was their protector, their hero, the man who never failed to make them laugh. To support his family, friends organized a fundraiser that far surpassed its original target. A walk up Mount Snowdon was planned in his memory, with many taking part dressed in dog-themed onesies, a nod to Lenny's love of animals, especially dogs. At his funeral on March 11th at Green Acres in Rainford, the family asked mourners to wear Crocs if they owned a pair, adding a personal touch that reflected Lenny's light-hearted side. The service became a celebration of his life, rather than just a moment of grief. The trial of Elias Morgan and Anthony Cleary is ongoing at Preston Crown Court, presided over by Mr. Justice Goose. Both men stand accused of the murder of Lenny Scott, a charge they continue to deny. Cleary also faces an additional count of manslaughter, which he has pleaded not guilty to. From the outset, prosecutor Alex Leach KC outlined the case as one driven by revenge, calling the killing a deliberate and calculated execution. The jury has been presented with the full timeline of events along with digital and forensic evidence, CCTV tracking Morgan's reconnaissance visits, telematics data showing the Mercedes' journey across Europe, phone records linking both defendants in the lead-up to the attack, and forensic evidence tying Morgan to false plates and the vehicle used. All of this, the prosecution argues, paints a clear picture of Morgan as the shooter and Cleary as his trusted accomplice. As proceedings continue, the jury will weigh the evidence before delivering their verdicts. The trial remains ongoing with further evidence and witness testimony expected in the coming days. 4 cases, 4 different cities, 4 different circumstances. But when you lay them side by side, a pattern emerges, one that reveals how violence in Britain's criminal underworld isn't random chaos, but a structured system with its own terrible logic. Martin Hamilton demonstrated that through sufficient cruelty, one person could build an empire on fear alone. He showed that if you scare your victims badly enough, you never face justice, until someone decides you've become more liability than legend. Bailey Atkinson and Connor Brooks showed what happens when gang feuds become self-perpetuating cycles. One killing sparked another, not because anyone gained anything from it, but because the code demanded it. Respect, reputation, revenge. These abstract concepts became worth more than life itself. Sam Davies showed how organized criminal networks enforce internal discipline. When someone breaks trust, when someone becomes a liability, the response isn't emotional, it's calculated. A contract, a message, a body left where others will hear about it. And Lenny Scott showed that even institutional walls can't contain these cycles. Even prison officers, people tasked with maintaining order, can become targets when they threaten someone's control or expose someone's secrets. What connects all 4 cases isn't just violence, it's the economics of violence. In these worlds, brutality isn't irrational, it's currency. It maintains hierarchies, it enforces contracts, it signals to others what happens when rules are broken. Police and prosecutors have become skilled at piecing together these cases. CCTV networks track movements, phone data maps connections. Forensics tie suspects to weapons and vehicles. Digital breadcrumbs that seemed invisible to killers become highways for investigators. But solving individual cases doesn't break the cycle, because for every conviction, there's someone else waiting to step into the vacuum. For every gang member imprisoned, there's a younger sibling or friend ready to continue the feud. For every drug network dismantled, another one emerges to fill the gap in supply. The real question these cases raise isn't about individual guilt. The courts have established that clearly. The question is about systems, about communities where young men see violence as the only path to respect, about drug markets where enforcement requires brutality, about prison systems where relationships between officers and inmates can turn lethal. Breaking these cycles requires more than police work, more than longer sentences, more than tougher enforcement. It requires addressing the conditions that make violence seem rational in the first place. For the families left behind, the Atkinsons, the Brooks, the Davies, the Scotts, no analysis provides comfort. No systemic explanation brings their loved ones back. They're left with photos, with memories, with the hollow knowledge that their sons, their brothers, their fathers died not for any meaningful reason, but because they happened to intersect with a cycle of violence that had been turning long before they were born and will likely continue turning long after. These 4 cases, spread across years and cities, connected by patterns most people never see. They're not exceptions. They're examples. Windows into a world that operates parallel to ordinary life, governed by different rules, enforcing different codes. Martin Hamilton is dead, buried in a shallow grave by people who decided his time was up. 7 young men are serving life sentences for hunting Bailey Atkinson through Walsall streets. 4 more are imprisoned for shooting Connor Brooks in retaliation. 4 killers received life terms for stabbing Sam Davies on a quiet residential street in Lincoln. And Elias Morgan and Anthony Cleary face trial for the execution of Lenny Scott outside a gym in Skelmersdale. Justice, in the legal sense, is being served. Trials are held, sentences are handed down, families receive verdicts, if not closure. But the cycles continue. Because violence, once it becomes embedded in the logic of survival, doesn't stop with individual prosecutions. It adapts, it evolves, it finds new participants. That's the real horror these cases reveal. Not the brutality of individual acts, but the system that makes them seem inevitable.